Good morning. It's Pop again, Dennis Murray. Uh, Today is Popcast 56, and it's called Nature's Wisdom, Part 6. Nature, in its wisdom, has chosen to give us grandsons and granddaughters. And if we're lucky, they talk and we listen and learn. So last night I had the wonderful pleasure not only of having my granddaughter Maggie's bachelorette party come by my house for an hour, at which lots of my other grandchildren came, and my son Riley, Maggie's his daughter, and Diane, his wife, and their neighbors and friends, and Diane's sister, who I've known since, gosh, more than 30 years. And um, it was just so wonderful. So many dear friends and family. And I kept my social distance. I wore a mask when anybody got close, and I tried to keep people a bit away. But I had a lovely, lovely evening after everybody left, which was probably about 9 o'clock or so. Um, uh, Two of my grandsons, John Riley and Patrick, um, stayed and sat out back and ate some pizza and drank a few drinks and just talked. And I talked for a while about the things I've been covering in recent days, and then they talked. I asked them questions, and they had a lot to say, and it really shed some new light on things. Basically, they're raising a lot of important practical problems about the pure theory that I have been advancing, that our highest value is fruitful relating to each other. And what they're pointing out is that there are people on the far edges whose positions are just not acceptable, and they are themselves, um, in some instances, overwhelmed by hate. For example, this sort of thing happens, um, and or completely unable to consider any other opinion but their own. There was earlier in this year in the Democratic primary a debate on one occasion between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. And I watched it. I don't usually watch many of the debates until things get a little closer down towards the end, and you can see who the one or two remaining players are and watch their positions. But it was clear to me that Bernie is a person who is the purist. He has values. He won't compromise them ever. Um, there's much to be said for sticking to your guns. Um, but as a practical matter, in dealing with large numbers of people, the facts of the situation are so complex that often a hard and fast rule that you think is generally applicable fails, at least at the edges. And Bernie doesn't feel that he should ever, even in any circumstance, move off of complete fidelity to this set of standards that he's lived his whole life by. And Joe essentially, in my opinion, would have been well advised to turn to the public and say, Bernie is somebody I admire and respect. We've been friends for a long time. We've both been around for a long time. I'm just a different kind of guy. And Bernie can correctly point out that I'm not a purist. I have, on occasion, made votes that aren't entirely consistent with my general philosophy. But I've been here long enough for you to see that I live my general philosophy. And I struggle when I feel I need to make exceptions. But Bernie's right. I have on occasion made exceptions, and Bernie never has. So you, the public, have to decide, which do you think is more suited to be your president? Um, a guy who has more respect for the practicality and complexity of problems, sufficiently so that he's willing to bend principles on occasion, or a guy who absolutely thinks that that's just not right and who would rather lose the issue than compromise. It really gets down to, do you think compromise is a bad thing, a thing with no principles or that involves abandoning principles? Or do you think that relating to people is such a high value that compromise is honest, it has integrity, and you should vote appropriately on choosing between the two candidates? That's what I would have said. That's the way I saw what happened. Um, but this issue has been with us for forever, and I don't have any magical insight to resolve it. Honest people take both sides of this matter, uh, and you know, there's a related issue. What do you do when you have, for the moment, gained power? Your party and yourself, your branch of the party, is at the moment in the majority and seems to have the ability to do things. Um, do you push as hard as you can to go as fast as you can to make as many changes as you can along the lines that you think are desirable? Or are you worried about stuffing it down other people's face too much too soon? Um, and, this is a practical problem as well as a theoretical problem. You might well be a person, who thinks that there's integrity in compromise in appropriate circumstances, but you don't really know where the compromise line should be drawn now. You have power. Should you strike while the iron is hot? Or should you think in longer terms and say, I'm going to forego this opportunity now because I want the people of a different opinion from mine, different political opinions from mine, to see that I'm able to exercise restraint in how I use the power that's been given me, and hope that they will be impressed by that behavior. And when they have the power, also exercise restraint in how fast and how far they go to bring their policies into play. Um, and I think that our whole problem is we haven't ever really talked about these things. Um, we don't have political philosophy as a common part of our education where we speak honestly about these kinds of issues. How fast you go, when you have the power, you know, how do you feel about stuffing the other guy's face? Do you think that that's unwise? Where do our values line up? What do you, see a high value in trying to relate to people? And then when you get to the edges, I mean, for example, on racial equality, uh, are you going to say to the KKK, well, I don't agree with your opinion, but I do want to be in relationship to you? Or are you going to think to yourself, regardless of what you say, that these people are too far gone? They have become so filled with hate that essentially they need to be cordoned off from the rest of society and they need to be deemed pariahs and treated appropriately. is there ever a time when you want to say, I'd be willing to forgive you if you ask for forgiveness? But you'll have to ask for it. You have to recognize that what you've done, what you're saying, is wrong in the sense that it's a complete denial of a lot of people for reasons that make no sense. And it harms our ability to live together in community. So that until such time as you are willing to look at that, you're fundamentally a pariah to the great majority of mankind and will be cordoned off to the extent possible and dealt with that way. So which way do you go on that? And of course, you're never going to say, well, your point of view is, entitled to be enforced on the country if you gain power, because you're so deeply opposed to that point of view that you wouldn't ever want to allow it to have power. Um, and so then you're right back to where we are. We're dysfunctional. It doesn't matter who's in power. We're dysfunctional. Our government is not working very well at all. And we just keep flip flopping back and forth between one side or another being temporarily in power. And of course, the thing, do they have both houses of Congress and the White House? Do they have most of the state, control? Or do they have a mix here and there? One of the houses of Congress and the White House and some of the states. It doesn't really matter. The point is, there's constant change back and forth. States that used to be arch conservative are more liberal. States that used to be more liberal are very conservative. And the people that get put up as senators and representatives from the states change with the flow of events. It may take a decade or two, but it's a constant flow. And the control of the federal government power seems to be wildly changing every 2 years. So, we all know we're dysfunctional. Um, and part of it is because we haven't really talked over these things. I haven't been to school in a lot of years. I'm 77. I can barely remember the subject matter in geography or current events, that I may have covered in the first 12 years of school. Um, and So I have no idea what the curriculum is nowadays, but I can't imagine that there's a curriculum that honestly deals with these kinds of issues, because it's too risky. State school boards are very anxious to try not to, tick off any large constituency. And so you're not going to find, politically adventurous text materials, I would think. Um, like I said, I don't know, but it's my impression that this is not the sort of thing that's being covered in school. It's not the sort of thing that's being talked about, except in the angry sense that, we're mad because we're not in power, and we think they're doing a terrible job. This is not a conversation of the kind that I'm speaking of that we need to be having in our schools and in our communities. This seems a little off case here, but I'm going to talk about Jung for a moment in this context. Jung, created a kind of a process he called analysis. He and Freud had worked on this kind of, approach. It had been in the works somewhat before them, but Jung, was a major player in the early days of creating analysis. And his point was that Jungian analysis involves a lot of pain. There, there are things that need to be dealt with deep in your psychology that weren't dealt with in your earlier days. And they may be, and they often are, things that should have been dealt with in childhood, but not in every case. There may be other things. Regardless, the reason, in part, the effect having to deal with these things is it really hurts. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of, it hurts. So Jung said, if you're functioning well enough, so maybe you don't do, Jungian analysis, but if you're jammed, if you're stuck in place, if you're dysfunctional, uh, to the degree that you got to do something, then you're a candidate. Well, we can't do analysis of a country or, for that matter, a world population. Um, in part, we don't have anybody with special training on how to get dysfunctional countries to be less dysfunctional. And if you look around the world at how many countries are suffering from endemic corruption at every level, public and private, and have for their, entire, centuries and centuries of their existence, and have failed every time they try to do better, have failed to do so, have failed to succeed, and still suffer from this corruption, which saps the energy of the people in an incredible way and takes a good deal of hope away. And hope is where your life energy comes from. So if you're feeling rather hopeless about our own current political situation, then we need to find the equivalent of analysis. And the crux of analysis is there's somebody with special training. Well, we can't fix that. We could certainly start adding a lot more courses up and down the entire 16 or so years of education. We could have doctorates in this sort of thing. Some kind of public role in this in addressing dysfunction at the community level. But that's 30 years out, and we'd have to create jobs for these people. You generally don't have a large and thriving academic community studying something unless they can find a job doing it or teaching it when they are finished school. So this is all pretty far in the future. So but you can realize that is a key element of what Jung has to teach us that may be applicable is that much of what's going on in creating our dysfunction is that we're being manipulated by symbols that touch us deep inside, where we can't even see that we're being manipulated, and where we can't really deal with the material, where our passions are easily inflamed, and our capacity to reason with ourselves about matters this deep in our psyche is quite small. So, and you've seen that when people on either side of the current divide attempt to talk to others, it very quickly becomes a shouting match. Nobody's listening, and everybody's written off the other guy. And supposing that I should get 4 or 5 people from each side to sit down, put on a nice steak dinner in the backyard, a couple of drinks, and the only condition is you have to listen. There's a lot of people that would say, I'm not having dinner with those people. They wouldn't use the word people. They'd use some other word that I don't really want to use in a podcast. Thanks for a free dinner, but I'd have to listen to those guys, and I'm not going to. Not for the price of a dinner. I'll go buy my own dinner. Thank you very much. And that's where we've gotten that far. What we can do, though, is recognize that symbols work both ways. There are symbols of hope and symbols of gift and of connection. And they, of course, can influence us to have more hope, and it gives energy to us. And the energy can be translated into us actually taking steps towards each other, and then the miracle of the expanding middle may possibly occur. So it's true that symbols can be used to stir up hatred, but it's also true that they can be used to stir up hope and a sense of oneness. And so, probably one of the things we'd want to be studying more is the use of symbols in public life. And we would want to become more skillful at recognizing when the symbols are manipulating us to be hateful and angry, and when they're encouraging us to be more hopeful and 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 make first steps towards each other in furtherance of an appreciation that's how you live, being a gift to each other. So, thanks to my grandsons, just a small note, those two grandsons were in the same age bracket, and they've always been, tight like that their whole lives. Here they are in their mid-20s, and one's in the political world as an administrative side of the political world, and the others in the tech world. But it's so much fun to be together with them. And I babysat those two together when they were little ones. And the three of us were called the Stinky Boys. And I still have a hat that says Stinky Boys. And just being with those guys it kind of inspires me, it gives me more hope, and makes me want to reach a little harder at trying to, cross the aisles, trying to, be more open to the other guy, and listen more. Okay, thanks so much. See you tomorrow. Take care. Bye-bye.